April 1950. The Savoy Ballroom on Lenox Avenue between 141st and 141st Streets occupied an entire city block in the heart of Harlem, a massive entertainment venue that could accommodate 4,000 people on its spring-loaded dance floor. On Friday evenings, the ballroom filled with couples dressed in their finest clothes, dancing to big band music performed by orchestras that included some of the most talented musicians in New York. The atmosphere was elegant, despite the working-class backgrounds of most attendees. Men wore pressed suits and polished shoes. Women wore dresses they had saved money to purchase or had sewn themselves. The Savoy represented a place where Harlem residents could experience beauty and sophistication in a neighborhood that mainstream white society dismissed as nothing but poverty and crime. At 9:30 on this particular Friday evening, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson entered the Savoy Ballroom with his wife, Mamie. Johnson was 44 years old, a man of average height with the distinctive bump on the back of his head that had given him his nickname since childhood. He wore a charcoal gray suit tailored specifically for him, a white shirt with gold cufflinks, and a silk tie. Mamie Johnson was 36 years old, a woman born in North Carolina who had moved to Harlem in 1938. And who had worked as a waitress before meeting Johnson in 1948. She wore a burgundy dress with a fitted waist and full skirt, pearl earrings, and her hair styled in the fashionable waves that required hours of careful preparation. The Johnsons were known throughout Harlem. Bumpy Johnson controlled the neighborhood's numbers rackets. The illegal gambling operations that employed hundreds of people and that generated substantial revenue from thousands of daily customers. He had held this position since 1935, when he negotiated an agreement with Lucky Luciano, allowing him operational independence in exchange for sharing profits with the Italian mob. He was called the Godfather of Harlem, a title that reflected both his criminal authority and his role as someone who helped community members in need, providing food to families, paying for funerals, settling disputes. Mamie Johnson was known as the wife of the Godfather, a position that commanded respect throughout the neighborhood. She was involved in St. Martin's Episcopal Church, participated in community organizations, and was treated with the courtesy that Harlem residents extended to someone married to a powerful man. But the marriage itself was genuine. Bumpy and Mamie had met at a diner shortly after his release from prison in 1948, had connected immediately, and had married 6 months later. Their relationship was based on mutual affection rather than just on Bumpy's status, though his status certainly shaped how others interacted with Mamie. When the Johnsons entered the Savoy that Friday evening, several people greeted them with respectful nods. The couple made their way to a table near the dance floor where they could watch the musicians and dancers while having conversation. A waitress brought drinks without being asked, whiskey for Bumpy, a gin and tonic for Mamie, anticipating what they would want based on previous visits. The ballroom was crowded, but not uncomfortably so. The band was playing swing music at a tempo that allowed for both energetic dancing and conversation. People were enjoying themselves in the way that working people enjoy an evening out after a week of labor, relaxing into the temporary escape that music and social interaction provided. At approximately 10 o'clock, 3 men entered the ballroom and moved toward the bar area. 2 of them were unfamiliar to most people in the venue, but the third was recognized immediately by anyone who paid attention to Harlem's criminal economy. His name was Vincent Romano, a lieutenant in the Genovese crime family who served as a liaison between the Italian mob and various operations in Harlem. Romano was 38 years old, a man who had grown up in Little Italy and who viewed Harlem primarily as territory that generated revenue for his organization. Romano's presence at the Savoy was unusual. Italian mobsters rarely attended social events in Harlem unless conducting specific business. The neighborhood's dance halls and nightclubs were spaces where black residents gathered, and white men who appeared in these spaces were typically recognized immediately as outsiders, whose presence signified something other than simple entertainment. Romano approached the bar and ordered drinks for himself and his two companions. Then he turned to survey the ballroom, scanning the crowd as though looking for someone specific. His gaze moved across the dance floor, across the tables, and stopped when it reached the table where Bumpy and Mamie Johnson were sitting. Romano said something to one of his companions, gesturing toward the Johnsons' table. Then he walked across the ballroom, moving between dancers, his path direct and purposeful. When he reached the Johnsons' table, he did not wait to be acknowledged, but simply stood there, looking down at Bumpy and Mamie. Bumpy looked up at Romano without expression. He did not stand or extend his hand. He simply waited to hear what Romano wanted to say. Romano spoke loudly enough that people at nearby tables could hear despite the music. He said that he needed to speak with Bumpy about a business matter and that this conversation should happen immediately. He said that Luciano's organization had concerns about how certain operations were being managed in Harlem and that these concerns required Bumpy's attention. The statement itself was unusual. Business conversations between Johnson and representatives of the Italian mob typically occurred in private settings where terms could be discussed without witnesses. Conducting such conversations in public spaces like the Savoy suggested either urgency or a deliberate choice to demonstrate something to observers. Bumpy responded calmly that he would be happy to discuss business matters at an appropriate time and place, and that Romano could contact him during business hours to arrange a meeting. This was a measured response that neither refused the conversation nor accepted the demand that it occur immediately in the middle of a social evening. Romano did not accept this response. He said that the matters requiring discussion were urgent and that Bumpy's position in Harlem depended on maintaining good relationships with Luciano's organization, which meant being available when the organization wanted to speak with him, not just when Bumpy found it convenient. This escalation shifted the interaction from a request to something closer to a command. It suggested that Romano was asserting authority on behalf of the Italian mob, requiring Bumpy to demonstrate subordination by interrupting his personal time to address whatever business Romano wanted to discuss. Bumpy remained seated and did not show any reaction to the escalation. He simply repeated that he would be available to discuss business matters at an appropriate time and suggested that Romano contact him the following week. Romano's face showed irritation at this continued refusal. He looked at Mamie Johnson, then back at Bumpy. Then he said something that immediately changed the nature of the interaction. He said that Bumpy seemed comfortable sitting with an ugly woman at a dance hall when he should be addressing business concerns that affected his ability to continue operating in Harlem. He said that perhaps Bumpy's judgment about priorities had been affected by spending time with someone who looked like that, gesturing toward Mamie. The insult was deliberate and public. Romano had characterized Mamie Johnson as ugly in a voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. He had done so not as an aside or a private comment, but as a direct statement meant to demean both Mamie and Bumpy in front of witnesses. The music continued playing. Dancers continued moving on the floor. But people at nearby tables had heard Romano's comment and were watching to see how Johnson would respond. Mamie Johnson's expression did not change. She sat without visible reaction, looking down at her drink rather than at Romano. Her stillness was the kind of discipline that came from years of navigating situations where showing emotion would be interpreted as weakness. Bumpy Johnson looked at Romano for several seconds without speaking. His face showed no anger, no offense, no reaction to the insult. He simply looked at Romano with the same neutral expression he had maintained throughout the interaction. Then Bumpy stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and placed his hand gently on Mamie's shoulder. He said quietly that they would finish their evening another time. Mamie stood, collected her purse, and walked with Bumpy toward the exit. Romano watched them leave, then returned to the bar where his companions were waiting. He appeared satisfied with the interaction, as though he had accomplished something by forcing Johnson to leave the ballroom. The Johnsons walked out of the Savoy into the April night. The temperature had dropped since they had entered the ballroom, and the air felt cool against their faces. They walked to Bumpy's car, a 1949 Cadillac parked on Lenox Avenue, and drove home to their apartment at Lenox Terrace without speaking about what had just occurred. Over the weekend, Bumpy Johnson thought carefully about the Friday evening incident. Romano's insult to Mamie was not simply a personal offense. It was a deliberate test of Johnson's authority and a demonstration to everyone who witnessed it that the Italian mob could disrespect Johnson and his wife publicly without consequence. The insult revealed something about how the Italian mob viewed its relationship with Johnson. When Luciano and Johnson had negotiated their 1935 agreement, the arrangement had been based on mutual benefit. Johnson controlled Harlem's numbers operations independently and provided Luciano with a share of profits. This arrangement had functioned effectively for 15 years because both sides benefited and because respecting the terms served everyone's interests. But Romano's behavior at the Savoy suggested that someone in the Italian mob was testing whether that mutual respect still existed or whether Johnson could be subordinated more completely. By insulting Mamie publicly and forcing Johnson to leave rather than address business matters, Romano wanted to discuss. Romano was demonstrating that he could disrespect Johnson without immediate retaliation. If Johnson responded with immediate violence, killing Romano that night or the next day, he would validate Romano's implicit claim that their relationship was based on force rather than on agreement. He would also risk war with the Genovese family, which would be destructive for everyone involved and which would likely end with Johnson dead or imprisoned and Harlem's numbers operations controlled directly by the Italian mob. But if Johnson did nothing, if he simply accepted the public insult and continued operating as though nothing had happened, he would signal that disrespect would be tolerated, that the Italian mob could treat him and his family however it wanted without consequences, that his authority in Harlem was dependent entirely on Italian permission rather than on his own capabilities and relationships. Johnson recognized that he needed a response that was neither immediate violence nor passive acceptance. He needed a strategy that would demonstrate clearly that disrespecting him and his family created consequences that made such disrespect unacceptable. while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that would trigger organizational war. This required understanding not just Romano as an individual, but the system he represented. Romano worked for the Genovese family. His behavior at the Savoy had either been authorized by his superiors or had been his own initiative, if it was authorized. That meant the Genovese family was deliberately testing Johnson's response to subordination. If it was Romano's own initiative, that meant Romano was acting beyond his authority, and his superiors might not support his behavior if it created problems. Johnson needed to determine which situation existed. If the Genovese family had authorized Romano's behavior, Johnson's response would need to address the organization's leadership. If Romano was acting independently, Johnson's response could focus on Romano himself while preserving relationships with Genovese leadership. Over the next 3 days, Johnson had a series of quiet conversations with people who provided him with information and perspective about what had occurred and what it meant. The first conversation was with Thomas Bradley, an attorney who had represented Johnson on various legal matters and who had connections throughout New York's legal and criminal communities. Bradley was 51 years old, a black lawyer who had built his practice serving both legitimate and criminal clients in Harlem. Johnson explained what had happened at the Savoy without mentioning his plans for response. He asked Bradley whether he had heard anything about changes in how the Genovese family was approaching its relationship with Harlem operations. Bradley said he had not heard about any formal policy changes, but he had heard that Vincent Romano was ambitious and was trying to expand his role within the Genovese organization by demonstrating that he could increase revenue from Harlem operations through more aggressive management. And this information suggested that Romano's behavior was his own initiative rather than authorized policy. The Genovese family leadership was satisfied with the current arrangement that provided stable revenue without requiring their active management. Romano was trying to demonstrate value by showing he could extract more from Harlem, but he was doing so without necessarily having approval from his superiors. The second conversation was with Reverend Samuel Henderson of Mount Moriah Baptist Church. Henderson was 66 years old, a community leader who understood both the legitimate and criminal aspects of Harlem's economy and who maintained relationships with various operators and organizations. Johnson explained that a representative of the Italian mob had publicly insulted his wife at the Savoy, and that this insult represented a test of whether such disrespect would be tolerated. He said he was considering how to respond in ways that would make clear that disrespecting Harlem families was unacceptable, while avoiding violence that would create broader problems. Henderson understood that Johnson was not just talking about personal retaliation, but about establishing principles that would affect how the Italian mob treated all Harlem residents. If Johnson's family could be disrespected publicly, then everyone's family could be disrespected. Henderson said that if asked, community institutions would indicate their view that operators who showed respect for families deserved community tolerance, while operators who showed disrespect created problems that required community opposition. The third conversation was with Dorothy Mitchell, who led several community organizations focused on family welfare and neighborhood conditions. Mitchell was 59 years old, deeply connected to networks of women who worked and lived throughout Harlem. Johnson explained that an Italian mobster had insulted his wife publicly, and that this insult represented a broader pattern of disrespect that the Italian mob might extend to other families if it was allowed to continue. He said he was working on a response that would make clear such behavior was unacceptable. Mitchell understood that Johnson was asking whether community organizations would support a response that addressed disrespectful behavior. She said that women in Harlem were tired of being treated as though their safety and dignity did not matter to the men who controlled criminal operations. If Johnson's response demonstrated that disrespecting families created serious consequences, that would be valuable not just for his own family, but for establishing expectations about how operators should conduct themselves. The fourth conversation was with Charles Luciano's attorney, Moses Polikoff, who served as a communication channel between Luciano, who had been deported to Italy in 1946, and his organization in New York. Polikoff was 49 years old, a well-connected lawyer who understood both criminal operations and the legal system. Johnson explained that Vincent Romano had insulted Johnson's wife publicly at the Savoy, and that Johnson was working on a response. He asked whether Romano's behavior had been authorized by Genovese family leadership, or whether Romano was acting independently. Polikoff said he would inquire discreetly. 2 days later, he reported back that Romano's behavior at the Savoy had not been authorized by Genovese leadership, and that in fact some leaders were concerned that Romano's aggressive approach to Harlem operations might create instability that would reduce rather than increase revenue. The leadership preferred the stable arrangement that had existed since 1935 and were not interested in subordinating Johnson more completely if that subordination would create problems. This information confirmed what Bradley had suggested. Romano was acting independently, trying to demonstrate value to his superiors by showing he could extract more from Harlem through aggressive management. His superiors had not authorized this approach and might not support it if it created difficulties. But with this understanding, Johnson developed a strategy that would address Romano's behavior specifically while preserving relationships with Genovese family leadership. The strategy involved demonstrating clearly that Romano's disrespect created consequences that made such behavior unacceptable, while ensuring that Genovese leadership understood Johnson was addressing Romano's unauthorized actions rather than challenging the organization. Johnson began implementing this strategy immediately. He sent word through Polikoff that he intended to address Romano's behavior and that this response was focused on Romano personally rather than on the Genovese family. But he wanted Genovese leadership to understand that Johnson was not breaking the 1935 agreement, but was rather protecting it by preventing unauthorized actions that threatened the stable relationship. Polikoff conveyed this message and reported that Genovese leadership had acknowledged it without objection. They were not going to protect Romano from consequences of behavior they had not authorized. With this understanding established, Johnson moved to the second phase of his strategy. He identified where Romano conducted his daily business. Romano worked from a social club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, arriving each morning around 9 and leaving around 6. He lived in an apartment on Elizabeth Street. He ate lunch most days at a restaurant called Umberto's on Mulberry Street. Johnson assigned 2 of his most trusted associates to observe Romano's movements for several days, documenting his patterns and identifying opportunities for action. These observations confirmed that Romano followed predictable routines and that he typically moved around Little Italy without bodyguards or security, apparently believing that his position in the Genovese organization provided sufficient protection. On Tuesday evening, 3 days after the incident at the Savoy, Romano left Umberto's restaurant around 7 o'clock after having dinner alone. He walked east on Mulberry Street toward his apartment on Elizabeth Street, a walk of approximately 4 blocks. The streets were busy with evening activity, people coming home from work, shopkeepers closing their businesses, residents out for evening walks. As Romano crossed the intersection at Mulberry and Hester Streets, 2 men approached him from different directions. One came from the left, one from the right. They converged on Romano simultaneously in a movement that appeared choreographed by its precision and timing. What happened in the next 30 seconds was not visible to most people on the street, because the 2 men positioned themselves to block observers' views. But when they stepped away and continued walking in opposite directions, Romano was no longer standing. He was on the sidewalk, appearing to have stumbled or fallen. People rushed to help him, believing he had suffered some medical emergency. But when they reached him, they discovered that he had been stabbed multiple times in the torso and neck. He was bleeding heavily and was not conscious. An ambulance was called, but Romano died before reaching the hospital. Police investigated the incident but found no witnesses who could provide useful descriptions of the 2 men who had approached Romano. People remembered seeing 2 men near Romano at the moment he fell, but descriptions were vague and contradictory. The men had disappeared into evening crowds immediately after the incident, and no one could identify them or provide information about where they had gone. The police investigation focused initially on whether Romano's death was connected to his work for the Genovese crime family. Detectives interviewed associates and reviewed Romano's recent activities. They learned that Romano had been expanding his involvement in Harlem operations and had been in contact with Bumpy Johnson shortly before his death. Detectives questioned Johnson about his relationship with Romano. Johnson explained that Romano had approached him at the Savoy Ballroom on Friday evening to discuss business matters, and that Johnson had declined to discuss business during a social evening and had suggested Romano contact him the following week. Johnson said he had not seen or spoken with Romano since Friday evening. Johnson's wife confirmed this account, as did several people who had been at the Savoy that evening and who remembered Romano approaching Johnson's table. Police found no evidence connecting Johnson to Romano's death. Johnson had been at his apartment at Lenox Terrace at the time Romano was killed, and multiple witnesses could confirm his presence there. The 2 men who approached Romano had not been identified and could not be connected to Johnson or his organization through any evidence police discovered. 3 days after Romano's death, on Friday morning, his body was discovered floating in the East River near the Brooklyn Bridge. The body had been moved from wherever it had been kept after Romano's death and had been placed in the river, where it was carried by current until it became caught on pilings near the bridge. The discovery of Romano's body in the river was reported in newspapers and created substantial discussion in both Little Italy and Harlem. People understood that Romano's death was connected to his work for the Genovese family, and that his body appearing in the river was a message rather than an accident. For people in Harlem who knew about the incident at the Savoy, the message was clear. Romano had publicly insulted Bumpy Johnson's wife on Friday evening. Romano had died on Tuesday evening, 3 days later. Romano's body had appeared in the East River on Friday morning. The timing and the circumstances created an obvious connection, even though no evidence proved Johnson's involvement. The message was that disrespecting Johnson's family created serious consequences. Romano had tested whether such disrespect would be tolerated, and he had received a definitive answer. The 3-day period between the insult and Romano's death had allowed Johnson to act strategically rather than emotionally, to ensure his response was measured and calculated rather than impulsive. The discovery of the body in the river added symbolic weight to the message. Rivers were associated with disposal of bodies by criminal organizations, with making people disappear. Romano's body being found in the East River communicated that his death was intentional and that his disrespect had been punished deliberately. For the Genovese crime family, the message was equally clear but more complex. Johnson had addressed Romano's unauthorized behavior decisively, demonstrating that independent actions that threatened stable relationships would not be tolerated. But Johnson had done so in a way that distinguished between Romano personally and the Genovese organization. Polikoff communicated with Genovese family leadership after Romano's death. The leadership indicated that they understood Johnson was addressing Romano's specific behavior rather than challenging the organization. They also indicated that they were satisfied with the resolution. Romano's aggressive approach to Harlem operations had concerned them because it threatened to destabilize relationships that generated reliable revenue. Johnson's response had eliminated this problem while preserving the organizational relationship. The Genovese family did not retaliate for Romano's death. There was no war, no escalation, no demands for compensation or revenge. The organization simply accepted that Romano had acted beyond his authority and had experienced consequences that his superiors were not obligated to address. This acceptance communicated something important to everyone in New York's criminal economy. The Italian mob recognized that its agreement with Johnson was based on mutual respect and mutual benefit rather than on Johnson's subordination. Or when that respect was violated by someone acting without authorization, Johnson had the right to respond, and the organization would accept his response rather than protecting someone who had created problems. Over the following weeks and months, the impact of Romano's death shaped how relationships functioned between Johnson's organization and the Genovese family. Representatives of the Italian mob who worked with Harlem operations were more careful about how they conducted themselves, more respectful in their interactions with Johnson and with community members, more attentive to maintaining the professional relationship that had existed since 1935. The incident also affected how Johnson was perceived in Harlem. The fact that he had responded to public disrespect of his wife decisively but strategically demonstrated both his power and his self-control. He had not reacted emotionally with immediate violence. He had withdrawn from the Savoy quietly, had spent 3 days developing a strategic response, and had executed that response in ways that eliminated the problem while preserving important relationships. Community institutions noted that Johnson had made clear that disrespecting Harlem families would create serious consequences. Women in the neighborhood felt that their safety and dignity had been defended when Johnson responded to the insult to Mamie. The principle that families deserved respect was reinforced by Johnson's willingness to enforce it against someone representing the powerful Italian mob. For Mamie Johnson personally, the incident demonstrated what being married to the godfather of Harlem meant in practical terms. The public insult at the Savoy had been painful and humiliating, but Bumpy's response had shown that he would protect her honor and safety decisively. The fact that Romano had died 3 days later, and that his body had appeared in the East River, was understood by everyone as Bumpy's message that insulting his wife was unacceptable. The phrase, 3 days later, became associated with this incident in Harlem's oral history. It referred not just to the specific timeline between Romano's insult and his death, but to the principle of strategic patience. Johnson had not reacted immediately with violence that would have been understood as emotional revenge. He had waited 3 days, had developed a strategic response, and had ensured his actions were calculated and purposeful rather than impulsive. The story was told in barbershops, at dinner tables, in quiet conversations between people who understood power dynamics in the neighborhood. A mobster had called Bumpy's wife ugly in public. 3 days later, that mobster's body floated up in the East River. The connection was never proven, no charges were ever filed, but everyone understood what had happened and what it meant. The legacy of the incident extended beyond Johnson's personal reputation. It established expectations about how criminal operators should conduct themselves in Harlem. Disrespecting families was unacceptable and would create consequences. Operators who showed consideration for community members would be tolerated. Operators who showed disrespect would face opposition that could include violence when necessary. The incident also reinforced the 1935 agreement between Johnson and the Italian mob by demonstrating that the agreement was based on mutual respect rather than on Johnson's subordination. When that respect was violated, Johnson had the authority and capability to enforce it. The Italian mob accepted this enforcement rather than challenging it because they recognized that stable relationships based on mutual respect served their interests better than subordination that required constant enforcement and that created instability. For younger people in Harlem who were observing how power functioned in the neighborhood, the incident taught valuable lessons. Power was not just about capacity for violence, but about strategic thinking and careful execution. Johnson's response to Romano's insult had been effective not because it was immediate, but because it was calculated. He had withdrawn from the Savoy rather than confronting Romano publicly. He had spent 3 days gathering information and developing strategy. He had executed his response in ways that achieved his goals while preserving important relationships. The 3-day period became symbolic of strategic patience. In situations where immediate emotional response would create problems, waiting 3 days allowed for careful thinking and better outcomes. This principle applied not just to violence, but to various situations where patience and strategy produced better results than immediate reaction. When Johnson died in 1968, 18 years after the Romano incident, people who had known him throughout his career remembered various moments that defined his leadership. The negotiation with Luciano in 1935 that established independent control of Harlem's numbers operations, the support he provided to families in need throughout the neighborhood, his relationship with Malcolm X and other community leaders, his various imprisonments, and his consistent return to leadership after release. But among the stories people told about Johnson was the story of what happened when Vincent Romano insulted Mamie Johnson at the Savoy Ballroom in April 1950. The story was told with the understanding that while no evidence had ever connected Johnson to Romano's death, everyone who understood power in Harlem knew what had happened. A mobster had disrespected Johnson's wife publicly. Johnson had withdrawn quietly rather than responding immediately. 3 days later, the mobster was dead and his body appeared in the East River. The message had been clear to everyone. The story taught that disrespecting powerful people's families was dangerous, but it also taught something more important. It taught that strategic thinking and careful execution achieved better outcomes than immediate emotional response. It taught that power came not from noise or from public displays of force, but from calculated action that achieved goals while managing consequences. Johnson's response to Romano's insult had protected his wife's honor and safety. It had reinforced his authority in Harlem. It had preserved his relationship with the Genovese family. It had established principles about respectful behavior that influenced how operators conducted themselves. All of this had been accomplished through strategic patience rather than through immediate violence. The incident was never formally documented in police reports or newspaper investigations that identified Johnson's involvement. Romano's death was recorded as an unsolved murder. His body appearing in the East River was noted as an aspect of the case, but was not connected to any specific individuals or organizations through evidence. But in Harlem's oral history, the story was preserved with all its details and implications. People who had been at the Savoy that Friday evening in April 1950 remembered Romano's insult. They remembered Johnson's quiet withdrawal. And they remembered learning 3 days later that Romano was dead and that his body had appeared in the East River. They understood the connection, even though it was never proven, and they told the story to younger people as an example of how power worked when it was exercised strategically rather than emotionally. The story became part of the mythology around Johnson, part of the collection of incidents that defined his reputation and his legacy. He was someone who protected those he cared about decisively. He was someone who thought strategically and acted carefully. He was someone whose power came from intelligence and organization rather than from impulsive violence. He was someone who understood that the most effective responses were often not immediate, but calculated, not public, but quiet, not emotional, but strategic. Romano's death and the discovery of his body in the East River 3 days after insulting Mamie Johnson became the definitive story about what happened to people who disrespected Johnson's family. The story was told with the calm certainty that came from community knowledge rather than from official documentation. No one needed a court conviction or a news article to understand what had happened. The facts were clear to everyone who had observed the incident at the Savoy and who had learned about Romano's death. And the principle the story taught, that strategic patience achieved better outcomes than immediate emotional response, influenced how people in Harlem thought about power and conflict for generations after Johnson's death. The 3 days between insult and consequence became symbolic of the time required for strategic thinking. And the body in the river became symbolic of consequences that were deliberate and calculated rather than impulsive. The legacy was not that violence was the right response to disrespect. The legacy was that when violence was necessary, it should be strategic rather than emotional, calculated rather than impulsive, carefully executed rather than publicly performed. This approach protected what was important while minimizing problems that uncontrolled violence would create. It demonstrated power while preserving relationships. It achieved goals while managing consequences. Decades after the incident, when people told stories about Bumpy Johnson, they would mention how a mobster called his wife ugly at the Savoy Ballroom. They would mention how Johnson had walked away quietly rather than responding immediately. And they would mention how 3 days later, that mobster's body floated up in the East River. The connection between these events was understood by everyone, even though it was never officially documented, never investigated successfully, never attributed to Johnson through evidence that could be used in legal proceedings. The story existed in the space between what was known and what was proven, between community understanding and official record, between strategic silence and clear message. It taught that some of the most important power dynamics occurred outside formal channels, and that the most effective responses were often the ones that achieved their goals while leaving no evidence that could be used against those who executed them.